Hey guys, Ryan Cleckner with Gun University, and now we just got done covering the basic parts of a scope, including deep dives into each one of those parts and how they work. We covered things like elevation turrets and parallax adjustments and adjustable magnification and ocular focus, first focal plane, second focal plane, reticles. Guys, we covered a lot of stuff about scopes. The question now is, how do you put that to use? What do you do with all this information? Well, hopefully you take all of that to make a good decision on the next scope you purchase. But which things really matter? Which things do you really need? Where can you save some money? Let's discuss that. First thing I want you to look at when you're considering buying a new scope is your budget. Your budget alone is a major deciding factor on which scope is right for you. You can easily spend $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 on a scope, and that could be an absolute waste of money for you if that's not the scope you need. If I had a choice, I'd rather you buy a scope that is good enough and save the rest of your money on some training or some ammo to get even better at using that scope and that rifle. So don't just go think that the most expensive scope is necessarily the best. However, you get what you pay for when it comes to scopes. Don't go buy a cheap scope just trying to save money if you can afford one a little bit nicer. As a general rule of thumb, I would rather you spend more money on your scope than you do on the rifle. That's not only because the quality of the scope matters so much when it comes to long-range shooting performance, but it's also this rule I've kind of learned to live by, which is it's easy to sell a used rifle. It's hard to sell a used scope. So get the good scope now and get a decent rifle and learn to shoot. Get some training, get some practice, get really, really, really good at shooting. And when you're ready to upgrade later, you can sell that used rifle and get an upgraded, nicer rifle to put underneath that good scope already. So start there with your budget. The other thing is ask yourself what features you really need. When we discussed that first focal plane where that reticle and the image get bigger and smaller together versus the second focal plane, the older way scopes used to be made where the reticle stays the same size, we talked about some pros and cons of each. Well, first focal plane is almost always going to be more expensive than the same scope in second focal plane. If you don't really need that feature, you can easily save some money on that. Also, what kind of turrets you're going to get, what size scope you're going to get, what weight scope you're going to get. Ask yourself after your budget, what are you really going to use this scope for? If this is predominantly going to be a hunting rifle, and you're going to zero the scope once, and you're going to go hunting with it and maybe shoot at 200 or 300 yards, and if you need to worry about distance, you're just going to hold a little high or a little bit low, you can save a lot of money on a scope. And you can also get a scope that's going to have less things that could potentially go wrong with it, like all these turrets that can get turned, by getting a standard 3 to 9x40 scope with capped turrets that's going to be great for hunting. And you can get a nice simple reticle and second focal plane and save a lot of money for your target scope where you might need to be spending more to get this fancier long-range scope where you're going to want things like your exposed turrets and first focal plane and things like that. So budget first, what can you afford? Next, ask yourself the purpose and what features you really need. That hunting scope with fixed parallax, I'm fine with that. Most of my hunting scopes have a fixed parallax. I don't need an adjustable parallax on a hunting scope. On a target scope, however, I want an adjustable parallax, so I'm going to spend the money for it. On a target scope, I'm very likely to use a reticle with adjustment measurements on it, and I want that first focal plane, so I'm going to spend some more money. So before you buy it, ask yourself what you're using it for, look at that budget, really decide what features are needed for you, and go get the scope, get it mounted to your rifle, and get out there and get shooting.